As promised, we are going to take a look at creating those watercolor techniques while we play with watercolors. We are going to use lemon yellow, indigo and yellow ochre and create another wonderful sunflower project. So come on over to the workspace and join me there. Last week we played with our sunflowers and created that scene with that background, and at the end I showed you how I played and created this piece. And today on the reverse side we are doing this. So what I'm going to show you is how to get the drawing on the page, freehand of course, we're not copying anything, and also how we are playing with those watercolor paints to get that effect. I am mainly self-taught, especially with my watercolors, and I've experimented over the years what works for me and what I like to use, and that's what I'm sharing with you on my channel. So I always have a piece where I start my project off, and that piece started in my sketchbook journal. And this whole month we have been working on sunflowers and experimenting with sunflowers, and today we are going to do that very last project to create watercolor effects with the limited palette of course. And without getting into it too much, I like to invite you over to the workspace so that we can get to that project today. Alright, let's go there. This type of sunflower. And that's only because you see such a variety of colors and line work. Some line work is soft and has soft flowy edges. Some flow into the background and others are sharp and classified as hard edges. So when we approach a drawing like this initially, you obviously are working with a two-dimensional surface, and when we work with two-dimensional surfaces we have to future project in a way so that you can understand where you are heading. But the basic principles of drawing still remain. Since we are drawing a sunflower, let's look at what makes this a sunflower. Well, it's long, flowy, floppy leaves, of course, and that very large center in the middle. Taking a look at that, you can see that my center appears large even though I drew it out really small. And the leaves are different sizes and different shapes to make it interesting, of course. And if you had a sunflower that looked similar to this, let me show you. These are also just drawings, and they come together nicely because the line work is showing you what you're supposed to see. Now this was taken from my dip pen inking class, being creative with sunflowers, and I'll leave a link below for you. But I just wanted you to see how you can manipulate line work in various ways to depict that essential parts of a sunflower. And comparing it to that, you do get a sense that you are dealing with sunflowers at this stage. Now our drawing is going to start out very childlike. When we go from here to another class I did where we literally just drew out some sunflowers, then added watercolor, the yellow parts, added ink lines, and then dissolved those ink lines, you do get a more whimsical, more innocent looking sunflower, but the basic elements are still there. You have your long floppy leaves, you have your windy or wind-blown petals, you have your large center in the middle that clearly shows light from the top and shadows in the bottom, and those thick, tall stems. So whichever sunflower you are going to draw today, please just have fun, don't be too serious, and you can follow me as well, and I'll show a demonstration on the back of this. Alright? Only because I'm a little bit too lazy to go get the watercolor pad out again. So we'll use the same piece of paper. Right, so let's make one large sunflower again, and I'll roughly start out by making jagged lines around a circle. So there's a circle and there are my jagged lines. And then I'll go in and create random petals that start from the center, go out. Let's try that again. So from the center, go out, make a floppy, fairly thick petal and return to the center. And just a little while from there, do the same thing but make the petal different. So I'm slightly elongating the front ones, and as we move around the flower, I want to create the sense of the backward ones falling back. So we will have them somewhat shorter, of course. And try not to make all of them exactly the same. You can overlap a few, have some peeking in from the side, just nice and loose. And of course there isn't a lot of space left on here because I'm flying off my imagination today. Get your stem in and then using a rugged, wild, jiggly motion there's that technical term again, get a nice sized leaf in there. We can always change it by erasing some parts and filling them in. I would like that to be a fuller, rounder leaf. So let's get that done. There we go. And we are just about ready to paint. So I'll get this camera on a tripod so that I can have both my hands available. Before I put it up, I wanted to show you the thumbnails from about 2 weeks ago. And you can go and check out that video where I talk a little bit about those little drawings and how to start a project with them so that you can figure out a few things. Right, let's get to this video again. Alright, so what else do I have on the table? Some blotting paper or tissue paper, my watercolors from last week, and we're only going to use the indigo and the lemon yellow. So I'll grab those out and make room for today's process. So some of my watercolor half pans have magnets at the bottom because I like to move them around where I want to use them, and that just helps the little pans to stay put and not fly off everywhere. So I'd still like to have some working space there. I'll have that available, and then my water container as well. Okay, and I always have that second bit of clean water that helps your paint to stay clean as well, and your paintbrush. And again today I'm going to use my broken number 12 round, or pointed round, which is a really lovely brush to use. Okay, so as promised, let's get you started on this project. So I'll just make a little bit of room here for me to move and not accidentally film the cables and cords hanging in my face. You wake up your watercolor palette by adding water to that pan. And I don't wet my whole palette when I work. I only wet the ones I'm going to work with. And there's one other color I'm going to use today, and that is that ochre. Can you see it there? And it's for adding a little bit of accents. I might even go for the warmer version, but I do have a problem with that as it looks kind of milky. Well, let's go back to this one. It seems to be doing the job. Now you can work with all your colors if you want to, but for the demonstration today I'm going to try and keep it to a limit, just so that we get basic techniques down and don't get carried away with too many colors drawing our attention. So the greeny parts of this mix I'll put over there, and when I want pure yellow I'll work from the pan itself. I'll keep it on the side as we move on to wake up the indigo, and the indigo will be used as that dark background. So let's have a look at that again. The dark background, and also to create our greens. Alright, so I'm not even going to prepare this page with any other methods. This is purely for demonstration's sake. Okay, so rinsing off the brush, grab some clean water and start wetting the petal area. Now I've left some dirt in the brush deliberately, otherwise you won't be able to see where I put that water down. So I'm not soaking the petals, I am just wetting the paper a little bit. Can you see that glossiness on the petals? Alright, so go around and wet all of them, and it's not going to be a perfect outlined petal effect. We are going for messy and random here today. Okay. So once you've reached that last one, you can grab some of your clean yellow and tip it into the wet puddles by making a color stroke from the tip to the center. And I don't want you to color it in or fill it in. I want you to make strokes, because those areas like that where the color is allowed to flow will give you far more interesting marks than what you would have had if you painted it in. And like I've said before, I'm not doing botanical studies. I'm having fun with my watercolors, creating flowers and playing with the paint and having fun. Alright, once those are in, we want to create a slightly darker center, and for that I'm going to use the ochre. So while everything is still wet, pop in some ochre, not that much. So if it was too much, wipe off that paint and soak it up. Get some fresh paint and place it in randomly. You can follow the petal shape. By all means do that, and define the direction, of course. Whoops, there we go. To guide the eye towards that center. So what I'm doing now is just flicking some paint into that center, and I'm slightly going to rinse that off, and with my indigo I am making brush marks. So just with some paint on the brush, dab it into those areas, and what we are looking to create here is color that flows into the existing yellows that will resemble the seed pods, creating rough shapes. I'll leave that for now, as watercolor always dries much lighter than what you see on the page now, and I want to leave room for secondary layers. Now this is no technical way to work with your watercolor paper, but I like to move my paper, and since this was already taken off the block, I'm holding it in my hand. I could have put it on a sturdier surface if I wanted to, but you should know me by now. I'm breaking all the rules. Okay, now to get that, let's show you that soft transition there. We need to work in a way where the wet in wet will meet each other. So these leaves or petals are still damp, and I want you to add some background color, like a lightish limey green, by simply placing it into that background. You can touch the petals if you like, add water if you like, and create interesting effects. See how the water created that bloom, and that makes it interesting. Now color variation also makes it interesting, so you can have color in that background that you will manipulate by dropping in wet some of your other colors. If you run out, just mix up a little batch more, because in this case we don't want our paint to have that one color boring wash. We are looking for interest. And every time you place your brush down, you can have a variation of that background color. Now to have that blend into each other, I'm using a clean, dried off brush. So this is called a damp brush, and I'm simply going to stroke my brush across in one sweep, making sure I keep my brush clean, to sort of blend the previous line with the existing line, and not all over and not in every place. This time around I added some water to soften that edge with the edge that was laid down already. So let's move around and make our mixture slightly darker as we go. So that puddle is still wet, and you are working from your wet into drier areas to reserve the flow, or to create flow. And you'll see I'm going to gradually start darkening up as we move around this flower. This is a nice place to stop, because it will be easy to pick up from there and move around the other side. Now admittedly it is way more difficult to work with your project floating in your hand like this, but I've developed some bad habits over the years and this works for me. Now you can have it mounted on a board and then use your board to move around. Alright, as you can see we are going darker and darker, and as we are going darker I want that edge to become more prominent, giving us the harder edge compared to the softer edges over there. Right, I'm just touching a dry area there to make sure I can move around freely. If I had this on a board, I would have been holding onto the board. And we lost the sunshine. Sure, you can still see what I'm doing. Alright. As you can see, we are going much darker really quickly. There are no rules here. What I'm doing now is cutting into a space classified as a negative space. So that is space between previously colored images, just to pronounce those leaves, make them more visible. Now it is advisable to work slightly faster, simply because you don't want your edges to dry on you too quickly. And having those variations in the paint makes it much easier to do, as you don't have to worry about matching up colors or having a continuous line that is the same color, because the wet and wet will blend into each other more naturally, giving you that variation, that color play, so to say. And you'll see that I'm not particularly careful when I cut into those shapes with the edge of the brush, as long as I go around and carve out that petal. I'm not even following my drawing lines, and I don't mind the drawing lines at all, as long as I'm following along and redefining the shapes and defining them from each other. Everything will look great at the end. And it would be silly for me to start adding, I don't know, car shapes in here, because we're not drawing cars, we're drawing flowers. So petal-y shapes and petal movements are acceptable for what we are doing today. And right here I'm adding in more of that yellow. Using all my various puddles. Oops. There's some more negative shape cutting into the picture there. And there's a difference between that and that because of the wetness, but also because the color does vary. And I'll add the color and then wash it out to nothing by adding bits and bits of water until I've been able to blend it into a satisfactory transition. Alright, so we do have our softer edges all the way up top and harder edges at the bottom. Now this feels kind of harsh, so with a damp, clean brush, I'm just going to soften that a little bit. Just so that our eyes don't jump to that spot. There we go. Now this will still dry a little bit lighter, but I am going to add a wash to the opposite sides to bring our focus back to balancing out those two areas. Again, washing out to nothingness into previously dried areas. So we have the beginnings of our painting there, and I'll use some of the paint that was left over in the palette by further defining some of our petals that come from the center. And even at times connecting them with that center area. Now the idea with watercolor is not to fiddle, not to overwork, not to go over and over and over on an area, and absolutely never to paint in the way you would with normal paint. I always use the analogy that with watercolor we are painting with water, so watercolor obviously works best when we have more water. For the leaves and the stem, I'm first going to add a limey green wash, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Once more, we are adding it in there, and if you overlap on the edge, it doesn't matter because it's lying on top of a darker area. Now to bring in some variation, you can mix up darker and darker shades, and while that is wet, just indicate where you'd like your shadowy areas and drag your brush into that area while it's still wet, darken it up more and play with your paint. Don't ever be afraid to experiment and wait for those moments to happen where your paint does what it needs to do all by itself without you fussing about it, and definitely without forcing it. We don't want to turn our watercolor practice, especially not if you are playing with me, into anything serious. Alright, this is dried somewhat, and all I'm going to do now is with a slightly thicker, more saturated indigo, I am going to show a few of those seed pods by tapping in with my brush to show their top heads. And in areas like these, blending it out once more with a damp brush, because I don't want them to look the same everywhere. Now I'm quite happy with that, and compared to what we did last week, it's looking pretty awesome. You can of course play with more color and add more layers and define areas more if you like. Maybe just show some shadow areas. And I'm still only using the colors that I've mixed up from either the lemon yellow, the ochre, and the indigo. And if you're not working from a reference like we are today, you are using your imagination. And those imaginary scenes, I believe, is experimental, and therefore no one can tell you that you did them wrong. They are based on your creativity and how you perceive things. So there is our watercolor technique sunflower on a line drawing or a pencil drawing that we created from scratch. Alright guys, so I hope you enjoyed today's video as we played and experimented with drawing sunflowers and of course playing with those wet in wet watercolor techniques. I'll see you next week, and until then I'll play out with a little video about my weeding progress. The cat and I had a lot of fun. See you next week. Bye.